It's 11 o'clock and people are still coming in, but yeah, time-wise, I think we should get started.
Okay, thanks. Good morning, everyone. My name is Brecht de Vleeschouwer, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to this webinar where we will outline and introduce the Belgian indices of multiple deprivation. Before we get started, I would like to sketch the context of the development of these indices before I then give the floor to Martina, who will be telling you much more about the details of the indices. The Belgian Index of Multiple Deprivation has been developed within the context of the ELLIS project, supported by BELSPO. And this project aims to set up new systems to monitor and mitigate environmental health inequalities. The project is coordinated by Sciensano and supported by the Université Catholique de Louvain, the Université Libre de Bruxelles, and the Universiteit Hasselt. So with the project, we want to establish a monitoring system of the extent of socioeconomic differences in environmental burden of disease and work out tools to assess the impact of policy measures on environmental health inequalities. So this means that when we started with this project, we had to come up with a way to define environmental health inequalities. And we defined this concept as the inequalities, the social inequalities in the environmental burden of disease, the number of deaths or disability-adjusted life years due to air pollution and other kinds of environmental stressors. To monitor this concept of inequalities, we have decided to work with an area-level indicator of social deprivation, which at the time of setting up the project didn't yet exist for Belgium. So this is why within the context of ELLIS, we developed the Belgian Indices of Multiple Deprivation. We then continued to use them for our assessment of health inequalities and environmental health inequalities. But what's crucial to note is that the indicators, of course, have a much wider purpose. So even though they were developed within the context of the ELLIS project and for the purpose of monitoring environmental health inequalities, they can be used for assessing any kind of social inequalities based on area level information. And they will also continue to live beyond the lifespan of this specific project. So that's for the context of the development of this indicator. We will then, of course, zoom in on the actual indicator, the details, and some examples of the applications. During the presentation of Martina, we will make sure that the microphones remain switched off so that there are no background noises. We will also have time for questions and answers. So if you would already have any questions during the presentation, you can start by writing them in the chat box. And otherwise, we will have a look at the chat or the list of raised hands to open the floor for questions and answers. The slides that we are using, the recording of the webinar will become available via our websites afterwards, which means that we can indeed get started now. So it's then my pleasure to give the floor to our dear colleague Martina. Martina is currently finishing her PhD at the Université Catholique de Louvain and will soon after continue as a postdoc. But within the ELLIS project, she has done a great job at conceptualizing, developing, and applying these new indices of multiple deprivation. So together with you as the audience, I'm very much looking forward to learning more about the index and to the insights that Martina will be sharing with us. So Martina, please feel free to take over and to get us started. Thank you.
Thank you, Brecht. Just a second for sharing the presentation. Hello, everyone. Welcome to our webinar on the Belgian Indices of Multiple Deprivation for the year 2001 and 2011. As Brecht mentioned, the indices were developed during the years of my PhD, and that is funded by BELSPO, and they are product of a collaboration between Sciensano, UC Louvain, and Hasselt University. In this webinar, in this presentation, I would like to introduce you the concept of the Belgian indices of multiple deprivation, explain their methodology. I will also show you their application or their use in the health inequalities, investigation, and time for the Q&As. So Brecht already revealed a little bit about the motivation behind the indices creation. So by 2020, there was the studies that they were published on social economic health inequalities in Belgium. They mostly used a simple measure of social economic status. That was one-dimensional. And we knew at the time that was an issue because deprivation is not one-dimensional, it's not univariate, it's complex, it's multidimensional. And we also were aware that abroad, multiple deprivation indices have been created and used. For instance, in the UK, they used the English, Welsh, or Northern Irish indices for decades for allocating deprivation, for pinpointing the hotspots of deprivation, but also for allocating funding for those in need. So we saw the opportunity for creation of the indices in the Belgian context. Through a thorough investigation of the existing indices worldwide, through the literature review, we identified criteria that we wanted the indices to fulfill. So we were sure that we wanted the indices to accurately locate the hotspots of deprivation. We also knew that their methodology would be quite complex, but we wanted to have the outcome that would be intuitive, that would be understandable to scientific, but also non-scientific community, because we had the idea on our mind that the indices would be publicly available. We also knew that the indices would be based on multiple domains of deprivation, and it was important for us to be able to decompose the indices into individual domains so they could be used separately, and you could also investigate different aspects of deprivation. And lastly, we want to create something that would be recyclable, you can say. It would be easy to update with the newest data. So this is how the Belgian indices of multiple deprivation for the year 2001 and 2011 were created, and they can be defined as a spatial and time-specific relative measure of multiple deprivation at the level of the smallest geographical unit in Belgium, statistical sector. And you can look at them as also composite measures that are represented by a suite of domain indices.
There is some delay between your presentation being shown and the slide, so I think maybe
now we lost.
Yeah, now we lost it altogether. So maybe we should try and reshare, and hopefully that would help now. And no? Yes, now we're back.
Good.
Thanks.
Do you want me to go back and show the previous slides again?
I think your explanation was
Okay,
very
good.
complete.
So, as I mentioned, the indices are based on deprivation domains, but the building stones of those domains are indicators. And in the 2001 Belgian Index of Deprivation, we have 24 indicators, and in 2011, the number reduced to 19. So you can imagine that we had to utilize quite large amount of data. The Belgian indices heavily rely on the National Belgian Census of the year 2001 and 2011. The data were provided by StatBel. We also used the National Registry database and the Civil Registry for the mortality data. We were also very grateful to Intermutualistic Agency provide us with certain data on indicators that we used in the health domain. And without the help of the Federal Police Belgium that provided us with crime data, we wouldn't be able to create the crime domain. So the units of analysis are statistical sectors. So statistical sectors are the smallest geographical units in Belgium. And each statistical sector falls into only one municipality. In the year 2001 and 2011, Belgium had almost 20,000 statistical sectors. But in our analysis, we excluded sectors with 10 or fewer individuals to have more stable estimates. And that corresponded to about 7.5 and 5.2% sectors that were excluded. But out of which almost 51% and 37% had 0 inhabitants. So why did we select statistical sectors? Why didn't we create the indices at the level of individual or municipality? So to create the indices on the level of the individual level, that would require much more data, or the access to data would be more difficult. So by creating the indices at the aggregate level, we were able to better accommodate the privacy, security, and confidentiality issues. To decide between statistical sector and municipalities, we wanted to choose the smaller unit, because we wanted to have something that's quite relatively homogeneous, and that can represent communities or neighborhoods. And we also knew that the boundaries of the statistical sectors have not changed much over time, and they would provide us with statistically robust estimates without smoothing. So what you are looking at now is the model, the methodological model of the Belgian Index of Multiple Deprivation of the year 2001. And the difference between 2001 and 2011, as I mentioned, is just in the number of indicators that were used. So they were reduced, and it happened mainly for the housing domain. So we went from 24 indicators in 2001 to 19 indicators in 2011. The index has 6 domains: income, employment, education, housing, health, and crime. And the building blocks are the indicators. So the indicators are either rates, such as rate of property crimes, or it's a standardized mortality ratios, or it can be a proportion, such as in the education domain, you can have early school leavers. And all these refer to some kind of deprivation experienced by individuals in a statistical sector. So the income, employment, education, housing, and health domains, they were created at the level, the indicators were computed at the level of statistical sector. But crime, because of the difficulty with getting data at the level of statistical sector, we estimated the rates at the level of municipality. But it means that each statistical sector within a municipality got the same rate. So with the indicators, the first step was to standardize them by ranking and then scale them, the scale between 0 and 1. So when we add them together, they would not exert different weights on the final score, on the domain score. So there were several steps. So for some of the domains, we just standardize them by ranking the indicators, then we scale them and add them together using basically real weights. In some cases, we had to use the smoothing technique, such as in employment and education domains. So we smoothed the indicators, then we standardized them by ranking, and once again, we scale them and add them together using real weights. And there was a third case in which we first standardized the indicators by ranking, and then we scaled them, but we use factor analysis, the maximum likelihood factor analysis, to generate weights to combine these indicators together. So you might be asking why we didn't use the maximum likelihood factor analysis for the other domains, but this method is suitable only for combining 3 and more indicators. And also you have to assume that there is a common factor behind. So at this step, at this moment, when we combined the domain's indicators together, we received the domain score. And it is when you can also use these domain scores separately. So if you are interested just in exploring the income deprivation, employment deprivation, education deprivation, you can just stay with the domain score. And for better interpretability, you can rank the scores and then assign them to deprivation deciles from 1 to 10. That's what we did. In the first decile are the most deprived statistical sector, and in the 10th decile are the least deprived statistical sectors. In order to combine the domain scores together, a few other steps had to be done. So first we ranked the domain scores. We get a domain rank. Then each domain rank was standardized and transformed to exponential distribution. And these values were then combined using weights above. So you can imagine that for almost 18,000 statistical sectors, for each of the sector, you had 6 different values that were the domain scores. And the weights that we assigned to those, they were decided on based on the existing indices worldwide. So once again, we looked what's happening abroad and which weights they used, but we also discussed that with the Belgian experts to have it in the Belgian context to see if they would agree. And the greatest weight was assigned to education, 25%. Then employment and income got 20%, housing and health got 15%, and crime 5%. So after combining the exponentialized domain scores with the weights, we just add them together and we get the overall Belgian index of multiple deprivation score, which you can also call the global score. And once again, same as what we did with the domain scores, we assigned the overall scores we ranked them and assigned them to the deprivation deciles from 1 to 10. So what you're looking at here are 2 maps of Belgium for the year 2001 and 2011. And the pattern is created by assigning the statistical sectors that were included in our analysis into deprivation deciles from 1 to 10. You can also see in gray the sectors that were not included. So 1 are the most deprived sector, they are dark red, and 10 are the least deprived sector, they are in the dark blue. And you can immediately see the north-south gradient. So the Flanders-Wallonia divide, with the most deprived statistical sectors being clustered, especially in the province of Hainaut, Namur, and also in Liège. You can also notice that the maps look quite similar. It's because there is very high correlation between the indices 2001 and 2011. It's almost 90%. So you might think of it as that not much has changed in terms of distribution of deprivation in Belgium between those years. So if we move on to the deprivation by domains, as you can see on the slide, the spatial variability across domains varies much more. And you can see different patterns. So you can see north and south gradient or west and east gradient. I'm not sure if you can see it properly, but on the top you have 6 maps that were created for the year 2011 by domains, and below you have the 2001. So you can notice the north-south gradient for the employment, education, and health domain. You can also notice the west-east gradient for a housing domain. And although there is some spatial variability across domains, there is not really a big difference between the year 2001 and 2011. So what I forgot to mention with the first map here, so what we have also noticed is that there was a high concentration of the most deprived statistical sectors. The most deprived areas of Belgium, they have always been clustered together, and there was the highest concentration of the most deprived statistical sector in the municipality of Charleroi. And the same we saw for the domain deprivation concentration. So the greatest number of most deprived statistical sectors in terms of income, employment, education, housing, and crime were located in the municipality of Charleroi. But the most deprived statistical sectors in terms of health were concentrated in the municipality of Liège. On the other hand, no municipality showed a high concentration of the least deprived statistical sectors. And it also applies to the overall deprivation. We haven't seen municipality with a highly concentrated number of the least deprived statistical sectors, the least deprived areas. What is also interesting that in the year 2001, Brussels capital region did not have at least one least deprived statistical sector in terms of crime. Just to mention, these percentages that you see were for the year 2001, but situation has not changed much in 2011. It was quite similar. So the index was created at the level of statistical sector, but we also provide higher level area summary measures. These are based on the statistical sectors, but they can be, so the overall index of multiple deprivation or just the domain deprivation scores, they can be used to calculate these higher area level measures for municipalities, arrondissements, provinces, or for the regions. And these include, for instance, proportion of statistical sectors that fall into the most deprived 10% nationally. Or we provide a measure that is based on the deprivation score. It's called average deprivation score or average deprivation rank based on the rank, and these two are population weighted. If you would like to know more about how they are calculated, I would like to refer you to our paper and the supplement where there are formulas, or you can email me and I will let you know more details. What you are looking at here now is the map of Belgium with average deprivation score at the municipality level. So this is the recalculated index of multiple deprivation for higher level summary, higher level area, so for municipalities. Once again, from the most to the least deprived deciles, and for sure you see the same pattern as it's the same data. So the next two slides, I would like to talk about what you can use the indices for and what you should not use the indices for. So you can use the indices for directly comparing statistical sectors across Belgium in a given year. You can use the ranks, look at the statistical sectors, and the closer the rank of the sector is to 1, the more deprived the sector is. So those with the rank 1 are the most deprived statistical sectors for sure. Using the indices or the deprivation domains, you can identify the most deprived areas, Belgium. You can pinpoint the hotspots of deprivation, but you can also explore which domain of deprivation is more prevalent, more prominent in that given area. You can also investigate changes over time, but only with caution, because the indices are relative measures, so the changes must be described in relative terms. So for instance, you can say that statistical sector X was more deprived in 2001 as it fell into the first 10 most deprived statistical sectors according to the Belgian Index of Multiple Deprivation 2001. And it was less deprived in 2011 when it fell into the 30% of the most deprived statistical sectors, according to the Belgian Index of Multiple Deprivation 2011. So you really have to be careful in how you word it. What can you use the indices for? So you cannot make inferences about individuals. The Belgian indices are aggregate measures, and they are measuring deprivation in an area. It means that even in an area that's designated as the most deprived, there are still individuals that are not deprived, and vice versa. Also, it does not measure affluency. So even in the statistical sector that has a small proportion of deprivation, let's say it's the least deprived statistical sector, it does not mean that there is a high proportion of affluency. So now we are moving to the Belgian Index of Multiple Deprivation tool that was created by Sciensano. And it's a really nice tool that you can all go and explore. It's easy to use. You can see the website here. So as an example, I look up Louvain-la-Neuve. I choose Louvain-la-Neuve because it also shows you the variability in distribution of deprivation in a small area. So for the tool on the left-hand side, you have a user interface where you can change the scale from statistical sector to municipality. You can also change the year from 2011 to 2001. And you can also change what you see in terms of the pattern. So right now you are looking at the overall Belgian Index of Multiple Deprivation deciles. And you can just look at the housing deprivation or income deprivation. When you type in the place of interest, it will automatically zoom in, and a window on the right-hand side will pop up where you will see the overview of the deprivation, different deprivation domains, their deciles for the given area, the sector. So I think it's a very nice tool that was created, and I really recommend you to explore the deprivation in your area. And thank you, Brecht, you just shared the link, I think. So if you are researchers or you are just enthusiasts in health inequalities or any kind of inequalities research, and you would like to use the indices by yourself, You can also download them from the GitHub, where we provide the indices for the year 2001 and 2011 at the level of municipality and also statistical sector. But we also provide you with the indices created without the health domain. So for instance, if you are interested in investigating health inequalities, I would recommend you to use the indices that do not include the health domain. We also provide you with the R codes that you can use to create the indices using the domain scores in a case that you would like to explore any other kind of deprivation, inequality that's included in the domain. So for instance, you would like to look into inequalities in income and you don't want to use the income domain in your index, you can create the index without the income domain. We also provide you with the shapefiles of Belgium. Brecht just shared the link, so thank you, Brecht. And now we are moving to the application of the Belgium indices of multiple deprivation in research on health inequalities. So this year, we also published a paper on trends in social economic inequalities in cause-specific mortality in Belgium, where we estimate the association between area deprivation and premature mortality between the years 1998 and 2019. In this study, we compute premature mortality rates, potential years of life lost due to inequality, but also population attributable fraction computed by cause of death, sex, period, and deprivation decile. It is quite extensive study of cause-specific premature mortality, but for this presentation, I would like to just show you briefly the results. So we used the overall index of multiple deprivation for years 2001 and 2011, and we grouped the statistical sector by their deprivation level. And what you are looking at here in the plot are the most relevant causes of death in the beginning of in the first period of the study. And those are the ones that had the greatest premature mortality rates between the years 1998 and 2003. On the top are the results for the men, and on the bottom are the results for women. So what you can also notice is that I only introduced you the results for the two opposite deciles for the most deprived. So those in the first decile and the least deprived, those in the 10th decile. And you can immediately notice the difference between the most and least deprived with much greater rates for those living in the most deprived areas. In women, there is one noticeable thing, and that's not all causes of death shown here have the greatest premature mortality rates in women living in the most deprived areas compared to the least deprived. So you can see that breast cancer, for instance, in a pink color, in the most deprived is a little bit lower in the beginning of the study, so in the first period between 1998 and 2003, compared to the premature mortality rate of breast cancer in women living in the least deprived areas. So the results of this study showed us that men and women living in the most deprived areas are almost two times more likely to die prematurely. So, and we also computed that 28% of premature deaths might be attributable to social economic inequalities. So what we did, we used the premature mortality rates from those living in the least deprived areas for the rest of Belgium, and we calculated an expected number of deaths that would occur if the whole Belgium had the age and sex-specific mortality rates of the least deprived areas. And then we look at the basically population attributable fraction. So what's the difference? And we computed 28% of those deaths might be attributable to socioeconomic inequality. Something similar we did for the potential years of life lost due to which before the age of 75. So the potential years lost are the years that are basically lost if the person dies before the age of 75. So it's a number of years that are up to the years of 75, age of 75. And once again, we used the sex and age specific mortality rates from the least deprived areas and computed the expected number in the most deprived areas. And it's about 30% of potential years lost due to socioeconomic inequality in the whole period studied. Another application that I would like to show you is in the current research that we are doing. You can see here the life expectancy at birth and modal age of death between the years 2000 and 2019. On the top are men and on the bottom are women. In this case, you see the distribution of life expectancy at birth, modal age of death across all deprivation deciles. So in the first deciles, I just remind you again, are the most deprived statistical sectors, and it's in the red, dark red, and in the 10th decile are the least deprived statistical sectors, and they are in the blue. And what you can notice immediately, if you just focus on the men, is the huge gap between the most and least deprived. Sure, the life expectancy at birth and also the modal age of death are increasing over time in all 4 plots, right? But there is a huge gap between the most and least deprived in men. And then when we look down on the woman, the life expectancy at birth in the left bottom plot, you can also see a gap between the most and least deprived. But for the modal age of death, which is basically the age when the most people die, you can notice that in the early years of our study, the lines are quite intervened. So I just plotted only the most and least deprived, so you have better look on the plots. And you can notice that for men, the inequality has stayed almost the same, right? There is a little increase between the years 2000 and 2018 for the life expectancy at birth, but the modal age of death stayed, the gap between the most and least deprived stayed constant. So we also saw that the difference between the most and least deprived in terms of males has not changed over time. And it's also that the pace of increase of life expectancy and modal age of death did not differ. It was the same across the 2 periods, 2 deciles, excuse me. But when you look at women, the gap between the most and least deprived in terms of life expectancy at birth increased by 2 years. And the difference between the most and least deprived in the modal age of death also increased. In this case, we saw different pace. We saw significant difference in the pace of increase in the life expectancy at birth and the modal age of death. So if you would like to know more about Belgium indices of multiple deprivation, I would like you to look at our paper called Measuring Small Area Level Deprivation in Belgium, the Belgium Index of Multiple Deprivation. And the paper is publicly available. If you have any questions, please do not hesitate to email us. And that's all for me now. Thank you for your attention.
Well done.
Thank you.
So thanks a lot, Martina. You can stop sharing your screen now. And so hi everyone, my name is Mara. I will be helping Martina in organizing the Q&A section here in this webinar. I think we can all agree that Martina has done an excellent job, not only in building the tool with the ELLIS team, but also in giving this wonderful presentation. So thanks a lot, Martina.
Thank you.
Now for the question part, I see we already have some questions in the chat. Brecht managed to answer a couple of them, but I believe one from Matthias de Roek is still open. He says, great work. Although there is little change over time, 2011 is already a while ago and many things happened in between. Do you plan an update in the future with data for more recent years? No.
Yes, I think that it's planned, but we don't know the exact date. I think it might be planned to the end of this year, at least to start the work on it, right?
Yes. So in the service health information, we will be building on this tool that Martina and the rest of the ELLIS team made, but we're still waiting on the availability of some indicators to rebuild your work for 2021. So this is in development and we'll hope to give you an update on the timing soon.
Yes. And I'm sorry, my camera is not working somehow. It's not that I would be so shy to show myself now.
Does anybody else has a question for Martina? You can raise your hand or put it in the chat.
I see that Luca has his hand raised.
Yeah, hi.
Hey.
Thanks for doing this work. When I moved to Belgium about 2.5 years ago, having done extensive amount of place and health research with a focus on inequalities, I sort of didn't realise how spoiled we were in Australia, having small area deprivation indices that are updated every 5 years based on the census. Here, when I moved to Belgium, I started looking for the deprivation index, and I'm like, where is it? How can a country not have a deprivation index? How do they make planning decisions without one? And then I started looking at census. I'm like, where is your census data? And I'm looking now, and again, you're having to rely on 2011 because the data to underpin these types of processes just doesn't exist. And I was really shocked at that. So I really appreciate the sort of work you've done on this. When I look at and zooming in on the maps that you've been created, it really strikes me the spatial patterning of the deprivation index. If I zoom in on Brussels, Ghent, Antwerp, across all of those cities, everything is considered in the most deprived.
Mm-hmm.
There's no variation within a city level. That something doesn't feel right about that. And also sort of then you look at the sort of patterning across the suburban regional areas of Flanders and then going down there again. Something feels there's too much spatial patterning to feel that there's not enough variation in some of these areas. There's just something that's feeling a little bit off about that. I can't quite put my finger on what it is. I think when I get to the regional areas, again, having sort of done critiques of the sort of measures in Australia and whatever, we find that things like income, retired populations have lower income in some areas. So that's why regional areas we tend to find are often classified as more deprived because they might have more retirees. They might have more people working in agricultural types of roles that don't require high education or something like that. They've left school early. So, but they're living comfortable, happy lives. They're not actually deprived as well. So one of the things that we did was create more localized measures sort of based on, within a 10-kilometre distance of where an area is, how is it relatively ranked according to everything else around it, those types of things as well. So just want to sort of get your reflections, particularly on the urban areas in Flanders, Brussels, Antwerp, Ghent. Why are we seeing no variations at the moment in there? What do you think the reasons for that is?
Thank you for your question and also very nice comments. So we have seen that the deprivation is really concentrated. The high deprivation is concentrated in the cities because there's a high population, great environmental exposure to unhealthy things. So I don't think it was surprising for us that really there was not much variation in terms of seeing least and most deprived statistical sectors there.
I just walking through Brussels, walking through Ghent, walking through Antwerp, I don't feel like I'm walking through the most deprived areas of Belgium.
Yes, I understand. I also live in Brussels, and I don't feel that the street that I live on falls into the most deprived, which according to the index does, but still, you cannot really rely on what you see. And once again, as you mentioned, individuals, we cannot say that in the most deprived statistical sector, in the deprived areas, are all people deprived, right? Because it's an aggregate mirror.
And Luca, I'm not sure if you're looking at the same thing, because if I look at the results in the tool, then I do see a gradient from the more central parts of these big cities to the more peripheral parts. So I do see some variability. It's not all dark red.
Yeah, but again, even in the most central parts too, I mean, I don't know whether it's a reflection of student population, younger population, something like that. But again, it doesn't strike me that if I walk through all of the centre of Brussels, all of the centre of Antwerp, something like that, that I'm faced with high levels of deprivation.
Yeah. No, but I mean, thanks for your comments, and I also think that as we move forward with the updates and the further development, that it would be good to be able to rely on your insights and expertise on that. So I think it would be useful if we could stay in touch on this and see how we can, learn from each other in towards the future.
I do have one other quick question too on, I wonder with this too, so there's quite some variation in the population size between your areas too, going up to, I saw in that list, over 7,000 people in some of these statistical sectors, and it sort of goes all the way down to the sort of, very 1, 2 people or so forth. Whether it's sort of reflecting something relative to the statistical sector population size, and I know there's all proportion indices used, but proportions become much more sensitive when you have lower numbers as well. So whether it's something to do with that, I mean, again, in Australia, the statistical area level 1, which is the smallest area that we get access to this data, is there's variation, but the variation ranges from about 200 people up to 800 people. So it's a much more confined number than going from 1 up to 7,500. I don't really know how you overcome that, but again, whether some of it's reflecting the high numbers in the areas, I'm not sure.
So the statistical sectors, I think there was a mean number of individuals around 500, and sure there was some variation. And as I mentioned, we also use smoothing techniques, for instance, for the employment and education domains, where for those indicators, as you mentioned, we had small numbers. So we used the Bayesian smoothing techniques to stabilize the indicators. And then if you move on towards the higher area levels, like municipalities, you can recalculate the indices, population weighted, taking into account that the population of each statistical sector differ.
And now that we're on the topic of the methodology, I'm going to sneak in another question from Maria Romeo, because she asks, what is the reason of having less indicators at 2011?
That's a very good question. The reason is the data accessibility and availability. So we, especially because it was in the housing domain, that we had to reduce the numbers of indicators. And in the 2001 Belgian national census, that we use for extracting the indicators from. They had more data on housing than in the 2011 Belgian national census. That's why.
Okay, I hope that answers your question, Maria. I see there's some other questions in the chat, and I also see the clock ticking. So I'm going to ask Romana's question now. She asked whether you've observed some prominent differences in COVID-19 related deaths in the most and the least deprived areas.
I did not work on the COVID-related deaths, but
yeah, so
did you?
To my knowledge, the index has never been used in COVID-19 related mortality yet. So there is some opportunities there if somebody wants to investigate it. It's a good point, Herman. Thanks.
Okay, thank you. Thanks very much. It's very, very, very good presentation and very good work. And I think I was just wondering, because we are also looking some COVID-related deaths in relation to French deprivation index, and somehow we found that very surprising results that the least deprived have the more less deaths and vice versa. So therefore, I thought if you had looked at that, so certainly for future, if I think that's interesting to explore this point, yeah, to see that, yeah. But the great work. Thank you. Thanks very much.
Yeah, I agree with Romana. I think there's a lot of room for opportunity here in using this index. So yeah, I'm very enthusiastic about it. I don't know whether there are any other questions related to how this tool can be used for their specific research, or other questions related to the methodology.
Perhaps one other quick question is whether you've also explored absolute levels of deprivation. I mean, it's common for deprivation indices to then be ranked and create deciles. But again, what we see is that something has to then be ranked as the most disadvantaged. So even if it has, pretty mild levels of disadvantage, even if it's not about, something has to be ranked in those bottom few deciles. Again, it's often why we see the urban spatial pattern, regional patterning in Australia, because of the type of thing. So do you have a sense, if you were to look at it in a different way rather than a relative ranking, whether the patterns would change a bit? Whether you would see a much smaller amount of areas you would actually consider disadvantage if it wasn't ranked?
So the question is whether we use the indices in the absolute differences.
Yeah, I mean, you can, again, if you're looking at things like unemployment, education or something, again, something has to come up as being the worst areas within those. So even though you might still have relatively high numbers of people with employment or education or something like that, across all areas, something has to be ranked as the worst, even though it's not that bad in a sense. So was that part of the exploration when you were developing this?
Yeah, so we look at the distribution, of course, the numbers, but I don't know if this would answer your question, but we are also using just the score. So we are not using only the ranks and the styles, but in the current study that I'm working on, we are using the scores, and we are looking at the spatial variability of premature mortality, cause-specific premature mortality across Belgium, and we can still see the same pattern.
Thanks, Luca. Does anybody else has a question? I would also be interested in maybe hearing from some people in the areas that have been identified as the most deprived, because I see there are some people here from the Hainaut region or province, or maybe some other people working in the field. What are your reflections on this tool? I think it still needs to be digested a little bit before some opinions can emerge. One last chance, if people have some questions, feel free to put them in the chat or to raise your hand. Two. There are some people who have raised their hands. But where are they?
Additional thoughts.
It's Stephen, I'm sorry, I'm having some issues with the WebEx system.
Marie from the Stadium as
Marie Merkling, please go ahead and ask your question. I'm sorry, I'm having difficulties with the different screens here.
Yes, thanks. I work in the Hainaut province, and effectively we see the same trends done with unidimensional indicators. But I'm happy to dig that with this multidimensional tool. That's all that I wanted to say.
Thanks a lot for your input. And now we also see that Koen de Groei wants to add something. Koen, please unmute yourself.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much for your presentation. I work for the Flemish government on a team working on poverty reduction, or at least we try to reduce poverty. The tool here presented offers what I think a real treasure trove also for local governments to analyze the situation. But you mentioned in your presentation, it's important to describe what the tool says, but also what it doesn't says. I mean, with that, there is a high risk. We see that also with a couple of indicators that we use according to poverty statistics. There is a high risk of wrong political use of the data. You could have the reaction that a sector with high deprivation means also automatically a failing local policy. And that's not always the case. It could be, but it could also be something completely different that's causing the deprivation. And therefore, I think it is really important to describe that in your paper, in the tool, that the cause of deprivation can be complex, and it's not always directly linked towards current policy. On the other hand, of course, it can be a real treasure trove in trying to devise policy on this field, and not only on the local level, of course, but also within the Flemish government and the Belgian government. So thank you very much for this work.
Thank you very much for your comment, and it's really relevant, yes. We agree with you that it's not always linked to the policies in the area. And it should be emphasized as well.
There are some questions in the chat, and I'm going to combine them also for time interest. There are some comments related to the geographical distributions. So Simon Couvreur says, are there any additional thoughts on the east-west gradient in housing deprivation? Also going to ask immediately that Maria Romeo says that she's actually surprised to see Leuven red colors. And Matthias thinks that maybe a student effect is in play there, lower income, no diploma yet. So what are your thoughts on these questions?
So I have received several emails in the past months asking me similar questions. What do I think about their address? Why does it fall into the most deprived area of Belgium? This is what the data show. We did sensitivity analysis. We cannot tell you the exact reason, right? In terms of the east and west gradient in housing deprivation, it might be caused by the age of the housing. That, for instance, all the houses are in the east rather than the west. And then the individual indicators that were used. So for instance, the presence of heating, if you have a center heating, there's a huge proportion of Belgium who do not have center heating, which is also surprising. And I don't know now if it was the east or west, but it's possible it was the east. I really recommend you to read the paper, look at the supplementary materials because it's written there in detail and you can learn more from there. For sure, the student effect is possible. Yeah, students usually don't have any income, right? But we don't look at the so much into the income. It's just one variable from the income domain. So.
Okay, and then the last question in the chat, I see that Clara Noiron is surprised to see that the health indicator is 10 out of 10 in Molenbeek. What could explain this? In other studies, we see a degraded health status in this municipality. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, it's possible that's because of the indicators that were used, which was the mortality. And 10 out of 10, it's the, you mean the, is it the least deprived, 10 out of 10? Yeah. And also it was in the year 2001 and 2011. So if you are comparing to the current situation, it's possible that it has changed, right?
That needs to be seen.
Yes.
Yeah, we'll keep you posted on that development. And then I see it's already 12 o'clock, but I see Poen de Vroei has still a hand raised. Poen, do you have a new question or it's gone now? So I'm guessing it was an old.
Sorry.
No worries. I wanted to give you the chance though. So in the interest of timing, I'm going to close the webinar now. I would like to thank Martina again and Brecht for organizing this, as well as Aline Scroggy, who has okay. I'm distracted by all of the WebEx situations going on here, but I would like to finish by wishing you all a pleasant afternoon and a good lunch, and thank you all for coming here. Thanks a lot and have a good day.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye, thanks.